Bum bum bum, literature gets a look. Legs talk about books. Hello and welcome to Legs Talk About Books, the monthly literature podcast where we talk about books. I'm your host, Hardleg Joe. Joining me today, once again, the Throwback co-host, old school from the first couple episodes, CB Radio.
That can't be duplicated.
He can't be duplicated. We've tried.
Mm-hmm.
We've tried. You also can't be eliminated.
That's how we got BC Radio. We don't talk about him.
We don't talk about him.
No.
But yes, today we're looking at two books, actually. Sort of a throwback episode. Same with having you host. I mean, you're kind of the regular co-host, but we've been having other people come in.
Yeah.
But this is a real throwback. If you missed it, the very first episode we did of this was on the Wheel of Time series. Because I had gone in, I had read the first two books, and they sort of helped inspire this podcast because I wouldn't say I liked the books, but they were interesting. They did some things I hadn't expected, things I hadn't seen before. They had just enough twists that I really wanted to talk about them.
And that seems to have fired you on, because you, other than the books we have been reading periodically for this channel per se, you have been devouring.
I've been going. I decided at the end of that episode, I was like, I don't know, I guess I'll read the third book to fill out the trilogy. And I read the third book, which is The Dragon Reborn. That's one of the books we'll be talking about today. And it was just overall good. Like I said, the first two books had their ups and downs, but Dragon Reborn was really the first book in the series where I just read it and just enjoyed it all the way through. Like, it wasn't anything special, but I just enjoyed it. And then I went to the fourth book, The Rising Shadow, and this is, without hyperbole, the best fantasy story I've ever read. And considering that for a little over a year now, we've been reading a whole bunch of fantasy stories and trying to get... I feel like that should be a lot, especially given that, I came in this with no expectations. I came into this expecting it to be this really up and down journey. And The Rising Shadow blew me fucking away.
It's all rising, no shadow.
All rising, no shadow. This is the first time in a long time reading a book where I've, gasped out loud. I exclaimed, I was like, holy shit, in my room at 2 o'clock in the morning reading this before bed. I laughed, I teared up a little bit, and this sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. This book is just that good. And so I'm like, we did the first two books, I want to talk about the next two books, because obviously they've impressed me in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of interesting things to unpack here. And, right now, the first episode is our most popular episode. It's got more than 1,000 views, where the rest have 300 or so. We'll see, maybe that was just popular because it's our first episode. Maybe Wheel of Time is more popular. So if you like this, let me know. I'm already reading the fifth one. Maybe in 4 or 5 months, we could do 5 and 6. Get those in here.
The Wheel of Time series.
The Wheel of Time, now, slowly going through it.
Here's the important question. Do you want them to watch the previous episode, or do we want to do a previously on Wheel of Time?
Well, as with always with this podcast, I never want to be the guy who's going to go plot by plot and explain the whole book in detail.
But there's a lot in there that you'd have to actually because this is
I'll be explaining some things. This will be a spoiler-full chat. I'm going to assume that they've either already read the book or they have no intention of reading the book. And likewise, I'm going to assume that they've either already watched the previous episode or have no intention of it. We're just going to go in and talk about this, because even though you haven't read these books...
I have heard these books.
Yeah. This is one of these instances where, as I've been reading those, me and Brandon have been getting together about once a week.
Yep.
And we go on a long walk where I explain the newest interesting things that have happened in the Wheel of Time. Because famously, if you missed the first episode, Brandon could not get past the first book.
There was just parts I couldn't, he got to the lower part and just kept going up. I could not get out of that valley.
Yeah, and I guess, I have a series of points written down, but I think we should actually start with the last one I had on here. Probably the most interesting thing about this series, at least to me, is just how slow it starts out.
Oh yeah.
And I watch another guy named Daniel Green. He reviews books and stuff. He's exclusively a booktuber, but he's also big into Wheel of Time. He has a bunch of videos on Wheel of Time lore and everything. And I saw a ranking of his where he was like, oh yeah, the first two are great, amazing books, and I could not disagree more. The first book, I barely made it through, and if it weren't for the twist ending, where I was like, okay, how are you going to continue a series after you've done that?
Yeah.
Because if you missed it again, we're going to go all spoilers from here. If you're not already going to read go read it now. I highly, highly recommend it. But at the end of the first book, they kill the main bad guy.
Yeah, it pretty much Star Wars. It's just like, oh, the enemy is defeated. It's all done. Yes, we can wrap it up in this one book.
Does that happen in Star Wars?
Well, the first one was supposed to be it didn't. It's a self-contained movie.
Yeah. That's the thing. The first book is clearly not a self-contained book.
Oh.
It clearly has a lot of things that it's setting up for the future. It clearly is establishing a whole lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, one of the things it's establishing is you have Rand al'Thor, who is the Chosen One, who must fight the final battle in Shad Al Ghul against the Dark One, the embodiment of evil and wickedness in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And they're destined to do battle and kill each other. And this has happened over and over. It's a cycle. It's a wheel of time. And at the end of the first book, Rand kills the Dark One. And he's still alive, and that wasn't Shad Al Ghul. And so then I'm like, okay, what are the other 14 books gonna be if you kill off the Dark One in the first fucking book?
Turns out it's all about Thom buying more tights.
Not quite.
I'd read a book about Thom buying, just like going from town to town, being like, these lederhosen do not work for me.
Fucking what?
No. I like Thom too much.
Thom is he's a decent character, but there's not much about him. It's really weird because they set up him in the first book as being sort of like the old wise man.
Oh yeah,
and then he sacrifices himself to let Rand escape, and you think he's dead, but no, he's in the he comes back
real quick.
Yeah, but going back to the point I was going to make is, after reading 3 and 4, the first 2 books really do feel almost like prequels.
Even though there's already a prequel.
Yeah, there is a prequel to it. The prequel's apparently like an almost unrelated story that just like has a little bit of backstory, but it's, I don't know.
Remember that third-rate character? We're going to learn about them.
I'm going to read the prequel after the 5th book. Because that's what Daniel Green says to do, and he's my source on Wheel of Time. But yeah, they really feel like prequels in the sense that when you see something, again, like Star Wars, for example, they had the movies, and then the prequels were largely about explaining things.
Setting up the movies.
Yeah, I was actually just I rewatched the Mr. Plinkett reviews of Star Wars, the prequels. No. You've seen those before, right?
Yeah, you should do that on a yearly basis.
Yeah, just once a year. If you haven't seen those reviews, he goes so in depth. The reviews are longer than the movies. And one of his main points is
in 3D.
Yeah. One of his main points is just the fact that, like, in the prequels, there's not really, like, a protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of follow Obi-Wan Kenobi, but he doesn't really have an arc. You kind of follow Anakin, but you're not with him for most of the time. And his arc is just sort of like, he's good and then he turns evil almost immediately. Like, in the second movie, he's already just kind of, like, angsty, and then he just goes downhill from there.
And honestly, that kind of works into the idea of it being a war movie, because in a war film, there shouldn't be a protagonist.
Yeah, but they don't focus on the war a whole lot either. The Clone Wars is kind of, like, it had to have its own show because they glossed over it in the movies so much, even though it was supposed to be such a big deal and everything.
This isn't about Star Wars.
Yeah. But my point is, the reason the prequels feel that way is because they're not concerned with telling this character's story. Mm-hmm. They're concerned with getting things from point A to point B. And point B is the start of episode 4. You need to get Anakin from a kid into the Vader suit. The Emperor needs to become the Emperor. And it doesn't really matter, like, how that happens. You gotta find a way to do it. And that's a lot of what the first book kind of feels like. Like, you're a little bit more invested. The first 2 books in Wheel of Time are not as bad as the prequels. Mm-hmm. The characters you do to get invested, there are some interesting things. But there's a lot of times when, like, you just meet someone, and you're not really sure why they're there in the plot.
The first, 2 books feel kind of like they're not like exposition dumps, but they're kind of like laying groundworks of the world.
A little bit. So I guess the best example is there's a part in the first book where everyone gets separated and they all go their separate ways.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the character things is Perrin and Egwene. And Perrin, they meet this guy who sort of like introduces the wolf powers that Perrin eventually develops.
Mm-hmm.
But then after him, he drops them off with a bunch of tinkers, the traveling people, who they follow the way of the leaf. They're pacifists. They believe that they would rather die than pick up a sword. They believe that life exists so that you could be tested for the afterlife, and the pass of that test is to never lift your hand in violence. Like, it's better to be killed than to kill someone. And that's interesting, but you spend these time, like, you meet this character, you meet a couple tinkers, you spend, like, several chapters with them, and then you just leave, and they don't factor into the rest of the story, and you're like, why are they even there? And then in book 4, they come back out of nowhere, and it's like, oh, I know these characters, and I know why. And there's this amazing moment where, like, Perrin is trying to help the Tinkers. He's like, come into our village, it's dangerous out there. And they're like, nah, we're gonna go on anyway, we'll go on as we always did. It's always dangerous for us. And then they go out, you know, and they get attacked by Trollarchs, and, like, everyone dies almost except for a small handful. And there's this young man they met before who is kind of like a rebellious, like, tinker almost. He liked dancing a little bit too much.
Oh, he's footloose?
He's a little footloose. But no, he's there in the aftermath when they've got everyone back and they're sitting at the inn just thinking about everyone who died. And this guy goes up and he picks up a sword. And he's like, can I have this sword? And he asks it to Perrin because everyone thinks Perrin's in charge for reasons that are difficult to explain without getting into everything.
Even for Perrin, they're difficult to explain.
But it's one of those things like, if you hadn't read the first book and spent time with the Tinkers and know, like, how big of a deal that was, it wouldn't have had the impact. But at the same time, they still re-explain what they are. Mm-hmm. You still get the idea. It's just one of those things, like, I feel like it would almost be better to read the third and fourth books first, and then you could go back if you want and read the first book and be like, oh, that's the Tinker who became the great swordsman.
Yeah.
Like, you get to meet him beforehand. And it's the same with there's a lot of instances where it's like, Thom runs around and he has a limp because of something he did, and then in the first book you're like, oh, that was when he defended Rand against this, yeah. So yeah, that's one of the things that I'm really curious to hear. I was actually trying to get another co-host to see if they could read starting with the third and fourth books and just go from there and see if they understood it, and I couldn't find anyone in time. But I'd be really interested if anyone out there, if you've been listening to me rant so far and you're like, hey, this sounds pretty interesting, if Joe likes it this much, maybe I should check it out. Try starting with the Dragon Reborn and see if it makes sense. Because they do this thing where every time they introduce the characters, they do re-explain who they are. Mm-hmm. They do re-explain the way of the leaf and the Tinkers and all these core concepts and everything.
As any good real, like, fantasy story does, tend to... They try and re-say it in different fancier ways.
They don't even re-say it in fancy ways. I feel like they use the same exact things over and over again. Not necessarily a fantasy thing, but a thing for, like, if you're putting out a book and it takes like 3 years for that book to come out, they just sort of assume that either you're not reading them all in a row, or if you are, it's probably like a couple months between or a week between or something like that.
They are reminded that people have short memories.
Yeah. Especially when it comes to just the absolutely massive cast of characters that this ends up getting. Like, holy crap. Especially, I'm in the 5th book, and like, there's a bunch of characters from the 2nd book that I thought were just dead, and then they resurface. And I'm like, there's so many people and places and things. I love it.
I love settings.
Maybe some people would get overwhelmed by it, but I absolutely love just like how fleshed out the world feels and how all the people feel and everything. But yeah, that's my homework for you. If you're at all interested, try reading the 3rd book. See if you can get through it. If you get like halfway through and you're like, I don't fucking know what's going on, then yeah, go back to the 1st book. Try to get through it. But it's so hard. It's like the JRPG of fantasy books. Yeah, but 30 hours in, it gets really good.
Yeah, it's like Dark Souls. Like, yeah, after an hour, you gotta play, and then you'll have fun. Like, no.
Giving an hour to get into a game, like, that seems reasonable. But there's a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, Final Fantasy XIV, it's very linear for the first 10 hours, 20 hours. But once you got the full party and you get the airship and the world opens up, then it's amazing.
Yeah,
and
Final
I feel
Fantasy
like
13 is what you're going for, and
yeah,
that's just, I couldn't.
13. I got those confused for a second. Sorry, but yeah, I feel like it's the same way. I'm like, look, this book is really great. Once you get to the fourth one, you just gotta read. You know what? Actually, let's look this up real quick. Yeah, so just looking at the audiobooks real quick. The first book in audio form is about 30 hours, almost exactly 30 hours. Mm-hmm. And the second book is 26 hours. So, literally, 55 hours in, it starts getting good. And then after book 3, which is another 24 hours, then it really gets good. So it's like, oh, gee, I feel so weird trying to recommend that, but it really does... To me, at least do that.
Rustles your jimmies?
No, Rustles my jimmies is bad.
Oh.
If something rustles your jimmies, you're upset by it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. You're just trying to, like, add in things because I'm completely dominating the conversation and you seem a little tired. Have a Fritos scoop.
No, I'm good.
We're not sponsored, but, I mean, Fritos, I'm already eating your scoops.
You want to put some money in on this.
If you want to put... how long before a YouTuber finally just gets a sponsor from, like, Frito-Lay? From, like... Bank of America, from like a legit like corporation and not some like tiny startup that's trying to sell a mobile game or headphones or something.
Brought to you by Raid Shadow Legends, by the way.
No, Rake Shallow Ledges. But yeah, we've been here for about a half an hour already. I'm not sure what it's been edited down to. And I've been saying this book is great. I suppose I should talk about one of the things that makes it so great.
Yeah, I mean, gushing for a half an hour is great, but I feel like
you gotta explain that gushing a little bit.
This is 2020, Joe. People can't just take your word for it.
You can't just gush without meaning. There's gotta be some force behind that gush. You gotta lush with your gush. Saying gush a lot just it sounds
gross.
Yeah,
we gotta move on from this.
Yeah, let's stop gushing for a little bit. So one of the really interesting things about the Dragon Reborn, the third book,
yes,
that immediately sort of gets my attention, keeps my attention pretty much throughout the book, is the perspective it's told from. Because all the books jump around in perspective, but up until this point, it's been pretty much assumed that Rand is the main character. Because you start with Rand and you end with Rand in the first two books.
Yeah.
And he takes up, I'd say about at least half of the chapters are from his perspective, probably a little bit more.
And he's perfectly milk toast. He's all toasted milk.
He's very generic. This is a book where there are 3 chosen ones who are all chosen for different things. Mm-hmm. And there's some confusion about who is the chosen one, which can make it really interesting. But Rand is the most middle-of-the-road milquetoast guy.
He's the one that if you've read a book, you're like, this is the freaking chosen one. Stop asking the question.
This is clearly... It's funny because I remember reading the first 2 books, and I was trying to avoid spoilers and everything. Like, I just immediately, when I looked up Rand, it's like, Rand al'Thor, the Dragon Reborn. And I'm like, oh, well, thanks for spoiling it. And at this point I realized, no, that's not a spoiler. Like, if you know going in that Rand al'Thor is the Dragon Reborn, you're not really, like, saving any drama or whatever. Going back and looking at it, it was obvious from the start. Mm-hmm. The only reason you wouldn't think it is because Rand didn't want it to be true.
Yeah.
And Jordan does perspective really well in that sense, that, like, when Rand doesn't want it to be true, you question it because you're really in his headspace and everything.
Oh yeah, that's really good.
And yeah, that's when you get to the Dragon Reborn, though, the one about him, you don't see it from his perspective. The first chapter is from him. I think one of the first chapters is from him. And in this chapter, they're like in a camp after the events of the second book. They've been there for a few months, and they're trying to plot what they should do, and Rand's really uncertain about everyone trying to pull him in different directions and control him. And he knows part of the prophecy is he needs to go to the Stone of Tyr. I think it's Tyr. It's Tyr or Tear. I don't know.
I'm gonna go with Tear.
Yeah, the Stone of Tear, and he needs to grab this ancient sword the sword in the stone, essentially. It's not actually in the stone, it's like floating, but it's got like
that
magic.
Makes a big difference.
Yeah. It's floating and no one can reach it because it's got, I forget what the male half of the Aes Sedai, Sadir. It's got Sadir energy around it, so
I
only...
didn't know that they actually had, I thought it was always just called male and female. I didn't know that there was specifically...
Yeah, I forget. They have different names for the male and the female side of the one true power. And it's really interesting how they channel it, but I can't get into that now. Either way, there's a barrier around this sword, and only a man who can channel can reach through it. So no woman can grab it, no normal man can grab it. And since no man who can channel is pretty much allowed to channel, they all go mad or they get stilled by the White Tower or whatever. That's like the prophecy, is that he will touch the sword that cannot be touched. The sword that is not a sword. And everyone's sort of planning like, okay, here's this roundabout thing. And then in the first chapter, Rand is just like, fuck it. If this is what's going to happen, I'm going to do it. And he just runs off in the night.
He goes immediately from, normal hero to super reluctant hero.
Well, it's not even, reluctant. It's just this, it's almost, suicidal, where he's like, I'm not the Dragon Reborn. If I am, then this prophecy must come true, no matter how haphazardly I do it. I am just going to run full, headstrong into this, and if I die, I die, and if I don't, then I guess I'll find out for sure that I am the Dragon Reborn.
It's like being told by a fortune teller you're going to die at 70 on a skateboard.
Yeah.
I'll stay away from skateboards and I'll be good.
And then everyone's telling you have to skateboard, so you're just like, well, fuck it, I'm going to they're like...
Turns out you were able to do an ollie at 3. Let's do this.
That's a really weird analogy we put together, but I think you get the idea. He goes from being this, milquetoast reluctant hero to, desperate almost. He runs off, and the rest of the story is spent trying to catch up with him. And the few times you do catch up with him, he's, living in the woods, and he's, cooked like raccoons and stuff, and he's just, dirty and disheveled. And apparently dark friends and other, enemies and stuff, shapeshifters have been coming in his dreams to taunt him. So even when, a friend shows up, he's just, makes a sword of fire, and he's like, I can't trust you. The last time I saw you, you tried to kill me. I can't allow it to happen again. Or, he's the one time you get his perspective in the middle of the story, he's, camping out, and some band of merchants with a bunch of guards come in, and they find him, and they're like, oh, we didn't expect anyone to be in this watering hole. Well, don't mind us, we're just passing through. And he's like, okay. Makes a fire sword and immediately decapitates all of them. And he's like, I can't trust anyone. No one. They could all be dark friends. That would already be kind of paranoid. But then he's like, they all think I'm the king. They think I'm the Dragon Reborn. Let's see them kneel before the dragon. And he gets all the bodies up, and he stands them up and makes them kneel before him. It's like, you might be a little crazy there, buddy.
All right. You need a Snickers. You get crazy when you're hungry.
Clearly, Randall Thor needed nothing but a Snickers to defy him. Yeah, but it's this really great thing where, I remember watching a video from the Nostalgia Critic, of all people.
Really?
Yeah. One of his analysis videos he used to do in between reviews. And he did one comparing the Dark Knight with the original Tim Burton's Batman.
Yeah.
And he was talking about, who has the better depiction of Batman, who has the better depiction of Joker. And the conclusion he came up with was that the original Batman was better because you don't see his origin story, because the story's not told from his perspective. So when he shows up, he's this mysterious figure that you're eager to know more about. Every time you meet with Bruce Wayne, you're super interested to see what he says because you don't know anything about Bruce Wayne. Whereas that movie starts with Jack Nicholson's Joker's origin story. And so he's less exciting. Yeah. He's just a criminal who fell in some chemicals or whatever. And then the Dark Knight is the opposite. You follow Batman the whole time, and the Joker is just this force of nature who comes out of nowhere, and you have no idea what his past is. And so it's this idea that whoever perspective you're following is inherently less interesting, less dynamic. And so if you want someone to be the coolest, most interesting character, you don't follow them.
Yes, well, it's mainly because nobody in their own perspective is cool.
Yeah, no one thinks of themselves as cool, or if they do, they're like super arrogant.
And that's
they're like
not
a
the person you wanna be in
sociopath.
the head, yeah.
They're a Kennet if you're the ship of magic. Yeah.
I was half a second away from saying that. You're freaking Kennet, and I want to sock you in the face.
I just want to punch you in the face. And so it's interesting to see this book from like years before that. I believe it. I'm not sure if this was from before the first. No, this was after the Tim Burton's Batman. But either way, he didn't see the Nostalgia Critics video. I can tell you that. But it's interesting to see that sort of theory put into action, where Rand seems super boring when you're Rand, and then the one book where he goes off the rails, you don't see his perspective, and it instantly endears you to like, what is this guy going to do? He went from completely predictable milquetoast generic dude to top 10 protagonist in the span of a book without you hearing hardly anything from his perspective. There's like 3 chapters. There's one you start with, the one in the middle where he acts crazy, and then one at the end where he's just sort of like, I guess I'm the king then, aren't I?
You can never get awe from someone's perspective. You get it from the people around him's perspective.
Yeah, seeing Rand crafted by the people around him makes you understand how dangerous he seems to everyone else. Even when to himself he's like, I'm just a farmer.
I just want to go home.
I'm just a shepherd. I don't want to be the Dragon Reborn. And then it's super interesting, again, going into The Shadow Rising, the 4th book. There's several chapters at the beginning from Rand's perspective. And suddenly he seems really reasonable, but he has the exact same beliefs. But when you go into his head and see why he's doing the things he's doing and why he's being paranoid, like, yeah, now I understand completely why he was doing that. That's perfectly understandable.
So the parts about him being like the super paranoid parts, like where the dark friends had been coming to him in his dreams.
Oh yeah.
Was that explained in the 4th book, or was that still something partially explained in the 3rd book?
That was explained in the 3rd book, because that was when Egwene was learning how to enter the world of dreams. She went and visited Rand. She found him when he was like camping, and he was just huddled around a campfire like, can't sleep, they'll visit me in my dreams. And then Egwene shows up, he's like, you've been here before, am I asleep right now? I can't tell anymore. And he just like channels and throws a fireball at her. And in the world of dreams, if some of you die in the dream, you die for real.
The usual through line.
Yeah.
On that.
Again, one of the really interesting things about this is how getting more knowledge makes the story more satisfactory. With the world of dreams, you first hear about it and you're like, oh, the world of dreams. And then you learn it's actually called Tel'aran'rhiod, and it's not really connected to dreams all that much. It's more of like an astral projection realm, and people have found a way to access it while asleep, and so they call it the world of dreams. But there's this idea that it's more than that, but you don't know what, but you want to read to find out more. It's this excellent like world building.
It's onion building. Like,
yeah.
You're like, oh, I pulled off another piece. Oh,
more onion.
Yes.
Maybe onion building is not the book, because onions aren't interesting.
Yeah, well, unless you like onions.
Yeah, it's more like a puzzle box, but done right because it has actual things at the end of the puzzle.
And it's not made by J.J. Abrams.
Yeah, look up his TED Talk if you want to know what we're talking about there. But yeah, it's got kind of the same thing. I think when we were talking about this the first time around, we talked about how Aes Sedai magic seemed like a really soft magic system. And I was like, I guess I like soft magic systems more than I thought. I still do. I'm realizing that more and more. I still don't really like the hard magic systems every time I read about them. The soft usually more interesting. But what's cool is as you go through this, you find out more and more that channeling is not a soft magic system. It just seems that way when you can't channel. And there's never a like aha moment when you realize it. It's only like when I'm talking to you and I'm like, yeah, there are a lot of rules, aren't there?
Yeah.
There are a lot of limitations and things that you can do.
I feel like a hard and soft magic system are kind of like perspective. Like a soft magic system is kind of like Rand in the 3rd book, where you're like, what the hell are they doing? How are they doing it? And then a hard magic system is when they start panning it out for you a little bit. it doesn't mean that it takes all the actual, like, quote-unquote magic out of it, but it does add more to it, and it gives it more solidity to it.
Well, the thing about the hard and soft magic is a lot of people use those terms as though they apply to, like, the magic themselves, when it's like a writing tool.
Yeah, it's
hard magic refers to whether you can use magic to solve your problems because it has rules, or if it's a soft thing and it's more about instilling majesty and seeing cool things and having, like, emotions come through. But I digress. That was all a tangent. The important part was that this is a writing tool, and he managed to have it both ways.
Yeah.
He managed to, in the first 2 books, even the 3rd book to an extent, have the channeling be this mystical, unknowable thing that solves some of their problems, but only when it's, like, the most dire circumstances. And then slowly, as you get into the 4th book, and especially the 5th book, it becomes more and more clear that what they did was a very tactical decision.
Yes.
It kind of goes back into the prequel thing. Like, I'm kind of interested to go back to that first book and look at everything Moriane did and just be like, oh, so she was channeling this, or she was doing that, or that's why she's so tired, or that's why this is happening. Or, oh, what does she have? An angry L? What size is it? Oh, okay, that explains why she could do this. But the cool thing about it is, at the same time they're turning this soft magic system into a hard one, they're introducing Tel'aran'groid, and that is soft magic. It is very much like you're in the astral realm where what you believe and what your willpower is becomes true. If you imagine yourself a knight in shining armor with a sword, you will have a sword. And there's cool parts where, like, Perrin enters the world of dreams, and he's, like, standing on a mountain, and he looks at another mountain peak, and he takes a step forward, and the world just blurs past him, and in that one step, he's, like, on the other mountainside. And it's just like, that's so cool, but that doesn't make sense, but whatever, it's fine, it's dream world.
So let that
literal dream logic.
So let that be a lesson to you, all you aspiring writers. You can be somebody who uses both soft and hard magic, or you can turn your soft magic system into a hard magic system. It just takes 14 books.
Yeah. It just takes several books worth of stuff to do.
You just need all the perspective.
There's a Dan Green video where he talks about why you should read Wheel of Time.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically just boils down to, if you like anything about fantasy, it's here.
Mm-hmm.
If you like soft magic systems, they have it. Hard, they have it. Do you like big, dark, pure evil villains who are just like the embodiment of doom? They have it. Do you like really interesting, thought-provoking, complex villains who are maybe shades of gray? They have those too. The 13 Forsaken are all pledged to the dark, but for vastly different reasons and go about it in vastly different ways.
Do you want waifus? They got plenty of those.
You got, like, they have a chosen one, and they have 3 chosen ones, and all 3 of them go about being the chosen one in vastly different ways.
Neapolitan.
I think he sums it up at the end. He's like, it turns out, if you have 14 books, you could do a lot of stuff. You could do just about anything you want.
Does he have one where it's just a filler where they play soccer?
Probably. I hear the 8th book sucks. I hear the 8th book is probably the one where they stand around playing soccer. It's also the shortest book, though, I believe, so we should hopefully be good. I don't know, I'm still...
a chapter long.
At this rate, it'll be 2022 before I get to it.
I mean, it's 14 books, man. It's not exactly something easy to surmount.
It's 15 if you include the prequel, which I am reading the prequel.
I forget, Jordan wrote the prequel, not
Brandon Sanderson only wrote the last 3. And the last one was, the last 2 were supposed to be one book.
Okay.
And he split them into 2 because there was too much he could do. And there's still, I believe the last one's still like one of the longest, if not the longest.
Damn.
The Shadow Rising, I believe, is the longest book in the series. The 4th one.
Oh.
And that it's a testament to how great it is that the longest one is also like the best one. There's so many good things. Which again, we kind of get back on track of that. Another interesting thing about the 3rd and 4th books, both dealing with perspective and with dealing with the characters in general. If you saw the first Wheel of Time thing, I talked about how Matt was an idiot.
Yes.
And I did not like Matt. Matt was completely just like, they go into an evil, spooky place, and they tell them not to touch anything, and he touches things, and then he lies about it, and then he lies about lying about it, and it just causes this cascade of failure that does all these things. And I'm like, I will never like Matt. And now Matt's like second favorite character. Maybe, no, third favorite. It's Perrin, and then Loyal, and then Matt. Loyal, he's the ogre.
Oh, okay, yes.
He likes to read books and stuff, but then he's slowly becoming like traveling bard, and I think it's kind of implying that he's riding the Wheel of Time as they go through it. I don't know. It's one of those things. I don't know, I'm really disappointed. I didn't want to go into the 5th book that much, but just the 5th book doesn't have Perrin or Loyal in it so far. And I'm like 3/4 of the way done, so I don't think it's going to. And I'm very disappointed because Perrin and Loyal are like together and they're like the best. I mean, they're not together, but they're in the same area. And I'm like, I want to know what happened to them.
Turns out book 8 is nothing but Perrin and Loyal. Too much of a good thing.
Yeah, so it's just like, yeah, Matt seems like an idiot. Then you see it from his perspective and I'm like, okay, I can see why you grabbed the dagger. You, like, the people who were telling you not to touch anything, like, you literally don't trust them, and I understand completely why you don't trust them. Like, it's a little silly, because I know that those people weren't trying to deceive you, but I understand why you thought that way. And then he also just becomes, he's such a lovable goofball. He just gets into all the shenanigans.
And I'm beginning to like him more and more. You can tell him about it.
All the knives everywhere.
Yeah. He gets that really cool, like, airport sequence where, like, please take out your weapons.
You're not allowed to bring any weapons into the city.
3 hours later. And then I got this knife boot and just...
He's just like, he pulls them out of his sleeves and he pulls them off. He's got 2 taped to his back and he has so many knives.
He invented tape just to do that.
He invented command strips just so he could put knives onto his back.
Another, if you'd like to support us, command strips. Go for it.
Well, I bought like 100 of them. I have so many command strips. That has nothing to do with books and everything. But now, so speaking of Perrin, though, there is one more thing I wanted to talk about that was that they kind of did really well. That I was really surprised at, because if you don't remember, Perrin has the wolf powers. He is the wolf brother.
He's the furry.
He can hear the wolves talking in his head, and he's kind of like resisted against it a little bit.
I thought that he just accepted it much faster than like Rand does with being the dragon.
Oh yeah, he definitely like accepts it, but he doesn't like it. That's definitely. I talked earlier about the 3 chosen ones were like different. I guess really just briefly, you have Perrin, who's basically like, well, if I have a prophecy, I guess I have a prophecy. Not much I can do about it. Better just do what needs to be done. Mm-hmm. Just do it and don't complain. Which doesn't mean he doesn't like it, but he just like, it has to be done. You do it. He's the blacksmith. That's what he does.
It's a problem. You got to see it through.
Yeah. You have Matt, who is like, fuck, I don't want to be here, man. Shit. His response is to just, I have a prophecy. Run in the other direction. Run as fast, as hard as you can, and do anything but that.
Too bad. That prophecy still happened.
Prophecy comes for you, whether you like it or not. And then you have Rand, who is in between. He has a quote in the 5th book that I really like when he's talking about Matt. When Matt keeps telling him, like, I'm trying to get out of here. And he's like, doesn't Matt realize that the wheel of time is, like, taking you along? Mm-hmm. It's better, like, if you go against the wheel, you're just going to get bumbled around. It's best to run with the wheel, and then if you can get ahead of it slightly, you can make one significant choice about your life. He feels like Perrin has given up, and he feels like Matt is being too stubborn. His plan is like, I really like Rand because he's always sitting there like, soon, you can't see it, but I'm rubbing my hands together. He keeps telling people, he's like, I've got a plan. I'm going to do something and no one's going to expect it. And all the Aes Sedai and the leader of the Ale are like, what are you going to do? He's like, if I told you, you would expect it.
Final battle, he pantses the dark one.
It's the longer it goes, the less you still hear. You go back into Rand, especially fourth and fifth book, but they still stay out of him just enough that you don't know what his plans are, and it keeps you thirsty for it.
Are you thirsty for Rand?
I might be just a little bit. I don't usually swing that way, but
maybe the wheel pulls you this way.
The wheel weaves as the wheel wills. What can I say? But, going back to Perrin, there's this sense, like, again, he was resigned to it. He's sort of like, whatever, I have wolf powers. In the second book, he helps them, like, track the Great Horn down, because he has enhanced smell, he could see farther, he could see in the dark and stuff like that, and he's just like, I can do it, I might as well.
Yeah.
And I never really got why he was disappointed to have powers. Like, I always felt like he's kind of like a stickler, and this bothers me in a lot of media. There's a lot of media where someone, like, clearly gets a superpower, and then it's just like, I never asked to be given all this ability. I'm like, you could do so much.
Spider-Man.
Why would, the Spider-Man complex. I mean, I kind of get it with Spider-Man, but I mean, his character's been, like, handled really well over however many decades or whatever. There's a lot of people where they try to do that and it just doesn't work. And it kind of wasn't working with Perrin. He was just sort of like, oh, my eyes are yellow. Because his eyes kind of glow in the dark.
My favorite color's purple.
His eyes are golden and they kind of glow in the dark. And he's like, a lot of people, when they see him in low light, are like spooked, and he's really like sad about it. But then in the third book, because a lot of it's told from Perrin's perspective as he's tracking down Rand along with everyone else.
Yeah.
They enter a village and they don't trust the Aes Sedai, but the Aes Sedai is like, I can heal people and stuff like that. She's trying to get on their good side. And they're like, well, we do have one guy, but I think he's beyond healing. And they've locked him in this shed, and the shed has, like, iron bars on it, and there's, like, claw marks around it, and it's clear he's been, like, chewing on it and everything. And they meet this guy who has the same yellow eyes as Perrin, but he just growls at them like a wolf, and he doesn't wear clothes, and he only eats raw meat. Apparently they put him in there because he attacked a cow and ripped its jugular out with his bare hands and was just eating the raw meat. And when they tried to stop him, he attacked them. And suddenly everything gets recontextualized where it's like, okay, maybe Perrin was the best person to have wolf powers, because if Matt or Rand got it, they'd be like, oh, sweet, and run with it, and they would have gone feral a long time ago. Because if you give in to that side of yourself, if you become too wolf-like, bad things can happen to you. And I really like that they managed to cover that aspect of it. So now there's sort of like a balance between him doing what needs to be done, but always keeping in the back of my mind, like, these are the consequences. I have to walk this fine line with these powers.
It takes 4 books to make consequences for your character's actions.
Well, this happens at the beginning of the third book.
We're getting a tally here. How long does it take for you to build consequences, to make a hard system or soft system hard?
How long does it take for all these different things? And this is kind of a spoiler, but I guess it's a spoiler for me too. I was listening to, again, Daniel Green. He has a Fantasy News where he talks about all sorts of different stuff, new books being released and like stuff being adapted. And one of the big things is that Wheel of Time is being turned into a series on Amazon.
Yeah.
Amazon is currently producing it, and he was going over like casting and stuff, who's playing who, and it's nice to sort of see like, oh, that's where they're going with Tom or whatever, or there's Lan with his perfectly angular face.
That's a point.
Every time they talk about Lan, it's always like he has a stone face. He has a face that's just completely chiseled. It looks as though if you threw a rock at it, the rock would break. He's just stone chisel face Lan.
Jordan was thirsty for some land then, was it?
They don't describe. They describe it as like his facial features were carved out of rock.
It's a big ass rock.
There's a vine I could show you, but anyway, the point, they were talking about casting and stuff, and he's like, this guy has been cast as a Trollarch, and he's like, oh, that's probably Neil. I don't think that's his name, but he's like, there's a named Trollarch. He's like, or it could just be playing a bunch of like background characters. But as soon as he said that, I'm like,
There's a name.
There's a Trollarch character. A good Trollarch character somewhere in this story. I don't know it for certain.
There's a Trollarch that gets a name.
Just to show you where it's like, does Wheel of Time cover everything you could possibly do? Mm-hmm. Yes, there's an orc who turns good. Or there's an orc who has a story arc of some kind.
A story orc?
Podcast over. Everyone go. We're done. It's gone.
We've lost the magic.
We've lost the magic.
Hard or soft.
That pun killed me. That pun, it's the Dark One's own luck or something. I don't know. I really love to like get the phrases and slowly work them into casual conversation. Mm-hmm. But I haven't quite gotten to that point yet.
Blood and gold, the dead is old.
Yep. Blood and ashes. Flaming blood and ashes, I tell you what. I forget, did I tell you about that guy?
Yes, you did.
Okay, yeah, he cursed.
Tell them about it.
There's a guy named Uno, because he has one eye, and he's in the second book, and like, his main character thing is that he always cusses, but cussing in Wheel of Time is saying flaming and bloody all the time. Like, these flaming women walking around with their bloody magic all the time, flaming running through this. And like, he says that, and every time there are women around, they're like, could you watch your language? There are children present. It's and then like, he's one of those, he's like the general in the second book. I'm like, okay. And then at the end, they leave him be. In the beginning of the third book, they mention that they sent them back. Mm-hmm. And then they run into him in the fourth book. And I'm slowly starting to realize that every character who has ever been named for any reason is going to be an important player in this game. Every town that has been visited, everything here has been laid down specifically. The whole rambling nature of the first book, where they just seem to be going to all these places, was all carefully planned so that later on it would come back to something.
You mean that tea shop that they went into?
That tea owner actually worked for the Blue Aja and was a secret spy for the Aes Sedai. She's also the reincarnation of Brigitte from the Age of Legends, who has been stuck to the wheel since the dawn of the Fifth Age. Fucking what? Are you serious? Yes, but trust me, it's true. I'm shaking the microphone. Either way, that's pretty much all the points I wanted to make. I wasn't sure. You've been listening to me ramble for a lot. Is there anything that you wanted to bring up? Anything that I've talked about before that you wanted me to elaborate on, or anything cool that you're just like, you should tell them about this thing before we go?
Not that I can think of at the moment. I really, really love the fact that this is a story that just keeps like getting more and more layers. And I do feel kind of cheating myself for not stopping at the first book and not trying to go forward. Though I do have a great storyteller in your regards, though. So yeah. I think I can catch up.
And I mean, there's always time to there's other stuff. Even with how much I've told you, there's all these times where I'm like, okay, so I didn't mention it before, but Brigitte was a character, and like, I didn't bring her up at all, or I'll be like, okay, so I didn't mention it before, but there's this whole subsect about the Black Aja and Lindrin and all these different characters. It's a testament to how much is in these books, that I keep leaving out all these things because they don't seem super important, and then they become super important. I have to explain them later and everything.
It kind of reminds me of the story I'm reading now, of like the live ship series. Not so much that there's a bunch of details that you're not seeing, but like there are through lines that I'm just not picking up on to give to people, and it's really, there's so much going on.
You're on the trilogy of a book, and it more connects. Because you haven't really read that many fantasy series before. You've read the one by Jim Butcher. Yeah. But those are all kind of like really self-contained. Like some stuff carries over from the previous books.
I wouldn't say so much that. They've got a pretty good through line on a lot of stuff. But the thing about his books were kind of, not to offend anyone, they were kind of like fantasy light. They didn't seem to fill as much with something like the live ship traders and such, where the world feels more breathed in and more lived in.
Yeah. I think it's interesting hearing you talk about the live ship traders and stuff like that, because even though I didn't like that as much, mostly because of Kyle.
Screw Kyle.
But I felt like it was a much more developed world. It was much more of this person had ideas they want to explore, whereas with the Furies of Calderon and the Codex Alera, it felt more like a popcorn flick, kind of.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting to see, like, you were really into that before, and now that you've read Live Ship, you're like, yeah, I can kind of see how that world feels flat compared to the Live Ship world.
It's the world as opposed to the characters, because the characters are still just as interesting in either one.
Yeah.
It's just that, like, it's kind of like putting highly detailed characters on Scooby-Doo background.
I think it's more like comparing Star Wars to Star Trek.
Yeah.
Where it's like, Star Wars does have some lore and stuff, it does have these planets, but it's very much like, and here's the ice planet, and here's the desert planet. And then you get to Star Trek, and there's much more hard science fiction of, like, this race evolved this way. Whereas in Star Wars, it's just sort of like, Darth Maul is red and black and has spikes on his head because it looks cool.
I mean, there's more to that. But yeah, it's this difference between, like, again, hard magic and soft magic in the sense of a story. Like, you can have this grand, overarching story and be like, this is fantasy, ha! Or you can be like, this is a fantasy world.
Yeah.
Here, let's explore.
And it's really been, like I said, I'm super excited because when I started reading fantasy like a year ago, I was really hoping to be drawn in. And so far, like, I read the first Dune, didn't have any desire to read anything else of it. I read the Codex Alera and the Name of the Wind, and even like the Lord of the Rings. Like, I read through all 3 Lord of the Rings, but I kind of felt like almost obligated to, and that was back in high school. I don't think I would like them as much as I do like now. Like, Lord of the Rings definitely has a foundation. Yeah, it sets the foundation for most fantasy writing and everything. But I never really found the characters all that compelling or the world all that compelling. And so it's super exciting to me to finally get one where I'm like, this is what I've been looking for all this time. Like, it's so complex, but I love the complexity.
Only 60 years later.
Only 60 years later. All these things. So yeah, I'm super eager to get in a Wheel of Time. I'm totally planning to get a map of the continent and hang it, like, get it printed out at Kinko's and hang it up on the wall and stuff. When I finish everything, I might even go to Jordan Con one of these years. There's
a frickin' con?
Of course there's a con.
Yeah, with 15 books, there's a con.
There's 15 books, and it's almost hard to understate, because even talking with you and everything, even talking on the podcast, it's hard to explain just the, like, amount of, like, world building this does. And especially, you don't get into it at all in, like, the first book. Or not that much. It's only in the later books where it's like, oh, you go to Tyr, and you go to Ilion, and you go to, like, Tachinko, and, like, their entire cultures feel different, but united in the same way that, like, American and Canadian culture is, like, fundamentally different, or, like, American and British culture is. It's like, yes, we speak the same language, we have kind of a shared heritage, but we have very different ideals, very different ways of dress and stuff like that. There's so many, like, fantasy and science fiction stories where every culture is, like, the culture of hats. Like, the Klingons are all about battle, and that's what they are. Or, I'm trying to think of a fantasy. The dwarves are all about building things and acquiring more wealth. And here it's like, the difference between an Illiner and a Tarian are, like, more subtle and developed than that. Where, like, someone, if you just put them next to each other, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference at first, but now I'm like, oh, if he's got that kind of, like, mustache, like, that's very stylish in Tear. Like, there's all this stuff like that it's really hard to convey, like, just talking to you. But as you read it, you start to notice, like, he'll put in a little detail about, like, this guy had this kind of shirt, or this guy was walking this way, or he had a cane. Yeah, or he had these kinds of shoes, or he was fighting with this style. And you start to pick up and realize that, like, in your head, you're connecting the dots and placing that person from this continent, or from this town, or this style of speech.
That's kind of how I feel about, like, for me to contrast something like the Butcher book to Live Ships. Like, in Furies, they talk about, like, the extended, like, the people who live outside of these cities being very, like, self-sustaining, you know, so they just talk about it.
Yeah.
Whereas in the live ship series, they're like, this is their culture. It's just this
and you get to meet them. That's the more important part. You get to, like, exist in that realm.
And you see that they're somewhat stubborn pride. You begin to admire it at the same time as seeing it as an obstacle. And it's just this really great character study of a people.
It's really weird when you look at cultures in books. I feel like there's almost like 3 different levels where, like, first you have the culture of hats, the, like, one-dimensional culture. Like, they believe in this and everyone just believes in that.
They like fighting.
Yeah. They like fighting. I'm trying to think of the dwarves or the elves. The elves are just all, like, high-minded. You're never going to find an elf who's, like, totally jacked and, like, loves to be a blacksmith and, like, oh yeah, dude, and who's, like, really rough and tumble. Like, they just they just act that way.
They have this superiority to them that they actually continue on.
Yeah. And then you have, like, the second tier upwards, which is kind of like what you're describing. Whereas, like, the culture is more complex. You have pros and cons to the culture. You can understand where they're coming from. But there's still this sense of, like, someone sat down and, like, created this culture. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I need these people to be really stubborn, but you know why they're stubborn, because I created their history. And then you have this where it's like, kind of like I said, I couldn't imagine an elven blacksmith. I couldn't imagine, like, a Bing Town trader who was, like, really foppish and, like, oh, like, very hoity-toity. They all seem like they have to be a little more serious than that.
Clearly you've never met Davor Restart.
He doesn't count.
I could tell you things about the man.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a better example. But it's just this idea of, like, you know, whether you're talking about Kalim or Karahane, I can imagine, like, what a blacksmith looks like, and what the king looks like, and what a pauper looks like. Every element of society, like, you don't even have to explain it. I know from how things are set up, how, like, they would be slightly different. Mm-hmm. It just feels so, like, lived in that I could imagine, like, visiting that city.
My thoughts are, like, how does one get to that level in writing?
I wish I knew that.
Like, because that's kind of, again, you were saying, like, elves and dwarves and all stuff, but, like, the Lord of the Rings, even with, like, how it's written, it's still very much like that. You get that with every different culture that you go into. Admittedly, it's a lot drier, a lot less.
I think the thing that carries, like, Lord of the Rings, that lets it survive even when its cultures are pretty, like, basic, is just how poetic it's written.
And, well, I thought it was written rather dry. I was going to say, like, more along the lines of, like, the tight-knit fabrics of, like, the details that he puts into it. Just, like, no one else had done, like, here's a world, and here's all of its lore. I'm just like, crap.
He was one of the first people, I think, who really, like, made maps, like, detailed maps of his world.
And languages, and...
Yeah, he developed them really well. So even if they're... I don't know, again, it's like, it's hard to feel like elf culture is anything but, like, one specific thing, but maybe that's the way he designed it. One of the ways that academics will read Lord of the Rings is sort of like post-World War I, where the elves sort of represent, like, Germany, where they're this very industrious, high-minded, pale hair, blue-eyed people who sort of have the ability to be really strong, but are past their prime. I haven't actually looked it up myself, but I know there's a way to read it where he sort of makes parallels. Like, the elves aren't supposed to just be a fleshed-in culture, they're supposed to represent something.
Yeah, but the only problem is that, like, Tolkien was like, don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't. It's a fantasy.
The author is dead!
The author is dead, let this just be a story.
No, the author is... Death of the author is a...
I know what that is.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if you meant, like, he's literally dead.
He is dead.
But he is literally dead, too.
Yeah, it's the double negative, the double meaning that, he's dead, and the story is dead of him. Let it be his story. Let it be just a fantasy.
Usually, when you say the author is dead, you mean that the author doesn't get to say what their work is about. You interpret it on its own merits.
Yes.
So, like, yeah, he didn't want to interpret that way, but he doesn't get a say in the matter. I'm going to interpret it and you can't stop me.
I feel like we've gone quite a deep bit into this last part here.
It's fine. We needed to have a little bit of a conversation, a little back and forth, so it wasn't just all gushing everything.
I know. I've had
Plus, I'm sure the people like it.
Yeah.
Comment in the comments if you like these sort of tangents about fantasy in general. I mean, that's sort of where this is going. The longer it goes on, the less it's going to be about the individual books, and the more it's going to be about, like, the story as a whole. And we got to compare it to other stories. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm going to have to read another series at some point, like all the way to completion, just to see how it is.
I feel you could do that when you're 35.
Either way, I think that wraps it up for now. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Ring the bell if you want to get notified. We do one of these once a month. Mm-hmm. If you want to join the Patreon, I have a Patreon Discord for anyone who donates $1 or more. There's a book club section on there where I talk about what we're going to be reading next month. I get questions and stuff from people. I didn't do it this month because I don't think anyone read The Wheel of Time. I think I'm the only one.
You already know there's a convention.
It's so weird that there's a convention and then I'm like trying to talk to anyone who's read it and like can't find anyone. Mm-hmm. No one reads anymore. I've cultivated the wrong kind of audience, but I'm trying to get more book readers in there. Join in there. We could talk about it. You can add more questions for next time. You could suggest things for next time. Although at the moment we've already decided what next month's book is going to be.
We're going into the dark territory.
We're going into the dark. I never wanted this show to be a show where we purposely read things that we knew were bad. Because I think that feels really cheap. I'd rather talk about really well done stuff. Mm. But I decided to try to change things up for April. April's kind of the goofy month. It's the April Fool's month. Yeah. I think April's going to be the month of bad books, unless this goes off terribly. But to start with, we're going to be looking at a very popular bad book. You may have heard it if you're familiar with Down the Rabbit Hole. It's Empress Teresa by some guy. I don't know his name.
May God have mercy on our souls.
Yeah. You could check that out. And I might have my friend Bardbreaker on here. Dan, the artist formerly known as Captain Cardsworth. He might be on here. He's promised to read it as well because I couldn't get him to read any actual books. But he heard about Empress Teresa. He's like, oh, I gotta check this shit out. Yeah. So we're going to be trying that. I don't normally advocate piracy, but given the author, you might want to consider it.
Yeah.
Maybe watch the Down the Rabbit Hole on it. I think it's only like 15 minutes long. It's pretty interesting. So either way, we'll be looking at that, and then we'll be back to like regular books after that. So don't worry, we're not going to be staying on goofy shit. No idea what's going to be after that, though. We'll see.
We'll talk.
I'm hoping once we get 1,000 subscribers, I want to open up a poll, and to celebrate the 1,000 subscribers, have people decide what we do.
So racist to that poll, my friends.
Yeah. Keep reading, keep subscribing, tell your friends if there's anyone you know who would like this. And until next time, we still don't have an outro. We had one, and now I can't remember it. You don't
remember it either.
Okay. Bye. I love you.